A prankster tries to mess with a royal guard, but instantly got humbled. It was a bright sunny day outside the royal palace. The large iron gates stood tall, guarding the grand building behind them. Tourists filled the area, snapping photos and chatting excitedly. Some admired the architecture, others pointed at the soldiers in their red uniforms and tall black hats, amazed by how still they stood. Among the guards was Corporal Edward Langley. He had been a royal guard for nearly 5 years and took great pride in his job. Standing straight and completely still, Edward looked like a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead. People often wondered how the guards stayed so disciplined, never flinching or reacting to anything. Edward had faced all kinds of distractions, tourists making silly faces, pretending to trip near him, and even yelling. But nothing ever made him move. Edward saw it as more than just a job. It was a duty. He wasn't there to entertain tourists. He was there to protect the palace and represent centuries of tradition. His uniform wasn't just clothing, it was a symbol of honor. He had trained hard to earn his place, and nothing could shake him. But today felt different. Edward sensed something unusual in the crowd. His sharp instincts told him to stay alert. That's when he noticed Jason Holt. Jason wasn't just another visitor. He was loud, flashy, and carried an air of arrogance. He wore oversized sunglasses, a bright jacket, and a microphone clipped to his shirt. Behind him were 2 cameramen, following his every move. He wasn't here to admire the palace, he was here to cause trouble. Jason was a famous prankster on social media. He had millions of followers who loved watching him make fun of people. His pranks often went too far, and today, he planned to embarrass Edward. Jason saw the royal guards as easy targets. They couldn't move or speak, making them the perfect people to mock for laughs. He started filming right away, speaking loudly into the camera. "Alright, guys. Today's the day we're going to make a royal guard move. I mean, look at them. They think they're so serious. Let's see if they can handle a little fun." People in the crowd turned to watch. Some looked curious, while others shook their heads, clearly disapproving. Edward, however, didn't move. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, and his face remained blank. Jason took that as a challenge. He walked right up to Edward and began acting like a clown. He waved his arms, pulled silly faces, and even danced in front of him. The crowd laughed, but Edward didn't flinch. "Come on, man," Jason said loudly. "You're not even going to blink? What are you, a robot?" He leaned in closer, snapping his fingers right in Edward's face. Still, there was no reaction. Edward had been through worse during training, so Jason's antics barely even registered. But Jason wasn't done. He reached into his bag and pulled out a toy trumpet. He blew it loudly, just inches from Edward's ear. The sharp noise startled a few people in the crowd, but Edward stood his ground. Jason turned back to the camera, grinning. "Nothing. This guy's good, but I bet he can't stay like that forever." The crowd's laughter encouraged Jason, and he decided to push further. He crouched down and pretended to tie his shoe, only to suddenly bump into Edward's leg. He jumped back dramatically, pretending to be scared. "Oh no!" Jason shouted. "I think I made him mad." The crowd let out nervous laughs, but some people started looking uncomfortable. Edward remained calm, though his grip on his rifle tightened slightly. He noticed something out of the corner of his eye: 3 men standing casually in the crowd. They were his fellow guards, dressed like tourists. They didn't look out of place, but Edward knew better. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. Edward's gaze flickered to them for only a moment, and that was enough. They understood. Meanwhile, Jason turned back to the camera. "Alright, guys, it's time for the big moment. We're going to do what no one dares to do. Let's see what happens when we touch the untouchable." The crowd went silent. Everyone knew the rule: never touch a royal guard. It was an unspoken line that most people respected. But Jason didn't care. He reached out and lightly flicked the tassel hanging from Edward's bearskin hat. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Phones shot up to capture the moment. Edward's jaw tightened ever so slightly. It was the only reaction he allowed himself, but Jason took it as a victory. "He moved!" Jason shouted, pointing to Edward. "We got him!" The crowd's laughter returned, but Edward didn't feel embarrassed. He wasn't upset. Instead, he felt focused. Jason thought he had won, but he didn't know what was coming next. The plainclothes guards in the crowd shifted subtly. One moved toward a bench, another walked toward the entrance, and the third adjusted his sunglasses. They were ready, and Edward knew it. Jason, completely unaware of the plan forming around him, turned back to the camera. "Mission accomplished, guys! Let's wrap this up." And Edward took a slow, steady breath. He didn't need to move or say a word. He had already set everything in motion. Jason had crossed the line, and now it was time to teach him a lesson. Jason and his crew started packing up, still laughing and joking. They walked away from the palace gates, but they didn't notice the 3 plainclothes guards following them at a distance. Edward stood tall, his face unreadable, but inside, he felt calm and focused. He knew this wasn't over. Jason had started a game he didn't understand, and Edward was about to show him that a royal guard wasn't someone to mess with. Jason Holt walked away from the palace gates with a spring in his step, his chest puffed out and his voice loud as he chatted with his camera crew. The prank, in his mind, had been a complete success. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head, the flick of the royal guard's hat tassel, the tiny tightening of the soldier's jaw. To Jason, that was proof that he had won. He had cracked the uncrackable. "What did I tell you?" Jason said, his voice full of pride. "No one can resist me. I always get a reaction. That's why they love me." He gestured toward the camera, grinning. "Say goodbye to the guard, everyone. Maybe next time he'll loosen up a bit." His cameraman chuckled nervously, but the assistant wasn't laughing. Jason," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "What?" Jason asked, pausing to turn around. "I think we're being followed," the assistant whispered. Jason's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, relax," he said. "It's probably just fans who saw us filming. That's what happens when you're famous." But the assistant didn't look convinced, and Jason felt the faintest twinge of unease. He brushed it off and kept walking, but his bravado had dimmed ever so slightly. What Jason didn't know was that the men following him weren't fans. They were the same plainclothes guards who had blended into the crowd during his prank. These men weren't amateurs. They were trained, disciplined, and most importantly, loyal to Edward Langley and the code of the Royal Guards. As Jason moved farther away from the palace, the guards trailed him at a safe distance. They didn't make their presence obvious, but every now and then, one of them would step just close enough for Jason to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. It was subtle, just enough to make him wonder. By the time Jason and his crew stopped at a nearby coffee shop, his confidence had started to wear thin. He kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes darting to the windows and the people passing by. "Did you see that guy?" he hissed to his cameraman. "What guy?" "The one with the sunglasses. He's been behind us since we left the palace." "Dude, you're paranoid," the cameraman replied. "Just enjoy the win. That video is going viral already." Jason pulled out his phone to check the views. Sure enough, the prank video was climbing fast, likes, shares, and comments pouring in. But instead of feeling victorious, Jason felt uneasy. He put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to relax. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted the same man again, the one who had been leaning against the lamppost earlier at the palace. He was sitting 2 tables away, reading a newspaper. Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Okay," Jason said under his breath. "Something is seriously wrong." Before his crew could respond, the man with the newspaper stood up and walked out of the coffee shop. Jason let out a nervous laugh. Maybe he was imagining things. But as soon as they left the cafe and started walking down the street, the same man appeared again, this time leaning against a lamppost. Jason's steps quickened. The guards weren't chasing him. They weren't even confronting him. They were doing something far worse. They were letting him feel hunted. For the first time in his career as a prankster, Jason felt out of control. He couldn't figure out whether it was all in his head or whether something bigger was happening. His cameraman, still oblivious, tried to lighten the mood. "Why don't we head back to the palace for round 2? Jason froze. "No," he said quickly. "We're done here. Are you serious? We can probably double the views if we go back for another round." "I said we're done!" Jason snapped. The sudden burst of anger silenced the crew. Jason started walking faster, looking around nervously as if expecting someone to jump out at him. But no one did. The guards didn't need to touch him to get inside his head. They were already there. As Jason turned the corner, he spotted something that made his stomach drop. 2 guards in full uniform, standing perfectly still at the edge of the street. They weren't blocking his path, but they might as well have been. Jason froze, his breathing shallow. His cameraman laughed nervously. "Relax. They're just guards." But Jason wasn't laughing. These weren't just guards, they were a message. They were a reminder that the Royal Guard wasn't something you disrespected without consequences. Before Jason could decide whether to move forward or turn back, one of the uniformed guards turned his head, just slightly, just enough to make eye contact. It was Edward Langley. Jason's face turned pale. Edward didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. But his presence said everything Jason needed to hear. Jason turned on his heels and walked in the opposite direction, practically dragging his crew behind him. "Where are we going?" the assistant asked. "Anywhere but here," Jason barked. As they disappeared down the street, Edward remained still, his expression unchanging. But inside, he knew the lesson was only just beginning. Jason had poked the lion, and now he was running scared. His heart pounded as he hurried through the narrow streets, his crew struggling to keep up with his frantic pace. The air felt heavy, and every glance over his shoulder revealed the same thing: familiar faces in the crowd. It wasn't paranoia anymore. He knew he was being followed. The cameraman, struggling to match Jason's brisk steps, called out, "Jason, slow down! You're freaking out over nothing." Jason whipped around, his voice sharp. "Nothing? Are you blind? They're following us. The guy from the cafe, he's behind us again. And those guards at the street corner, did you see how he looked at me?" The assistant tried to calm him down. "So what if they're following us? You're the guy who touched a royal guard. It's probably just security keeping an eye on us." Jason's eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "No. This is different. They're messing with us." His voice lowered, but his mind raced. He couldn't figure it out. Suddenly his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. A notification from an unknown number displayed one chilling word: "Smile." His blood ran cold. He looked up and immediately spotted someone holding a phone across the street. The man wasn't recording, he was just standing there, staring. Jason's breathing quickened. "This isn't funny anymore," he muttered, shoving his phone into his pocket. His crew exchanged nervous glances, but no one knew what to say. Jason had always been the confident one, the leader. Seeing him like this made them uneasy. As they reached an alley, Jason slowed down, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We need to lose them. Let's split up. Meet me back at the hotel in an hour." "But," the assistant began. "Just do it," Jason snapped. The crew hesitated but eventually walked in different directions, leaving Jason alone. He leaned against the alley wall, trying to catch his breath. For the first time in his career, he felt helpless. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Purposeful. Jason froze. He turned toward the sound and saw one of the plainclothes guards approaching. The man wasn't rushing or threatening, he was calm, like a predator who already knew his prey couldn't escape. "Leave me alone!" Jason barked, but the guard didn't respond. Instead, the guard stopped a few feet away, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He extended it toward Jason without a word. Jason hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He snatched the paper and unfolded it. Written in bold letters were 4 simple words. "You touched the crown." Jason's stomach dropped. The meaning was clear. He hadn't just messed with a guard. He had disrespected the symbol of authority and tradition that the guard represented. "Is this a joke?" Jason demanded, but the guard had already turned and walked away. Before Jason could process what had just happened, his phone buzzed again. Another message popped up. "Keep walking." He didn't need to be told twice. Jason broke into a brisk walk, his nerves fraying with each step. Every street felt like a maze, and every passerby looked like a spy. He finally reached the hotel and slammed the door behind him. But as he turned around, sitting on the hotel desk was another folded note. Jason grabbed it and unfolded it quickly. "We're not done yet." His phone rang. He jumped, fumbling before answering. "Hello? Enjoying yourself?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. "Who is this?" Jason shouted. The voice didn't answer the question. Instead, it said, "You wanted a reaction. You've got one." The line went dead. Jason's mind raced. He felt trapped, like he was part of some elaborate game where he didn't know the rules. His heart pounded as he tried to piece it together. They were getting into his head, turning his prank against him, and it was working. Desperate for help, Jason opened his laptop and pulled up his video from earlier that day. The views had exploded, hundreds of thousands already, but the comments weren't what he expected. Disrespectful. "You went too far. He deserves what's coming." Jason's stomach churned as he scrolled through the backlash. What he thought was funny had turned into a disaster. He wasn't the hero of the story, he was the villain. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the room. Jason froze. "Room service," called a voice. Jason approached the door slowly, his hands shaking. He opened it just a crack, and froze. Standing outside was Edward Langley. Edward was still in full uniform, looking just as calm and composed as he had been at the palace gates. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet authority that sent a chill through Jason. Jason stammered, What do you want?" Edward didn't say a word. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out another note. He handed it to Jason and turned, walking away before Jason could ask anything. Jason opened the note with trembling fingers. "You'll apologize. Publicly." He sank onto the bed, his heart pounding. He knew there was no way out of this. They hadn't touched him. They hadn't yelled at him. Yet they had completely broken him. Jason stared at the note, his confidence shattered. He had wanted to make the guards look weak. Instead, they had proven just how powerful they were without ever lifting a finger. And he knew this wasn't over yet. Those words seemed to burn into his mind, echoing louder with every passing second. He crumpled the paper in his fist and paced the room, his breathing shallow and uneven. His phone vibrated again. Another text. "Still smiling?" Jason flinched and nearly dropped his phone. He glanced out the window, searching for anyone who might be watching, but the street below looked ordinary. Too ordinary. It only made him more paranoid. Were they out there, blending in with the crowd? He couldn't tell anymore. He closed the curtains and tried to collect himself. "Okay, think," he muttered. "It's just a scare tactic. They can't do anything to me. Right? It's not like I broke the law." But his own words felt hollow. These guards weren't playing by the usual rules. Another knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His whole body tensed. "Room service!" Jason approached cautiously and opened the door just a crack. The hotel staff smiled politely and held out a tray with a covered plate. "Who sent this?" Jason demanded. "It was already paid for, sir," the staff member replied. "Enjoy." Jason took the tray and shut the door quickly. He set it on the table, staring at it like it might explode. Slowly, he lifted the lid and froze. Sitting on the plate wasn't food. It was his hat. The very same hat he had worn during the prank, now perfectly folded with another note resting on top. "We're watching." Jason's stomach churned. He grabbed the tray and shoved it into the closet, slamming the door. He couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. He grabbed his phone and called his cameraman. "Where are you?" Jason asked, his voice sharp. Back at the hotel." "What's going on? You sound... Get here." "No," Jason snapped. Minutes felt like hours as Jason waited, pacing back and forth. When the cameraman finally arrived, Jason yanked him inside and locked the door. "Did you tell anyone where we're staying?" Jason asked. "No. What's going on?" Jason handed him the note and pointed to the tray in the closet. The cameraman's eyes widened. "Dude, this is next level creepy," the cameraman said. "Maybe we should leave." "No," Jason barked. "If we leave, they win. I'm not running away." "But what if?" Jason cut him off. "No. I just need to figure out who's behind this and how they're doing it. They're trying to scare me, and it's working, but they can't keep this up forever." Jason's bravado sounded forced, even to himself. The truth was, he was scared. The guards weren't just embarrassing him, they were breaking him down piece by piece, and he knew it. Another buzz from his phone. "You're running out of time." Jason dropped the phone like it had burned him. The cameraman stepped back, clearly unnerved. "This is insane," the cameraman said. "I think we should just..." The hotel phone rang. Jason froze. He stared at the phone, dread settling over him like a heavy blanket. The cameraman gestured for him to answer. With trembling fingers, Jason picked up the receiver. "Hello?" No answer. Then the line clicked. And a voice, calm, steady, and all too familiar, spoke. "You'll apologize, Jason." It was Edward Langley. Jason's mouth went dry. "How did you? You wanted attention. Now you have it," Edward said, his tone even but unyielding. "You crossed the line. We're giving you a chance to make it right. Or this doesn't end." The line went dead. Jason slumped onto the bed, his mind spinning. He had never felt so powerless. These guards weren't reacting, they were planning. They were 3 steps ahead, and no matter what he did, he couldn't seem to catch up. The cameraman cleared his throat. "Jason, you need to fix this. Seriously. These guys aren't messing around." Jason clenched his fists. He didn't want to apologize. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized, this wasn't just about the prank anymore. It was about survival. His pride fought against his fear, but fear was winning. He stood up and grabbed his phone. "What are you doing?" the cameraman asked. "Going live," Jason said, swallowing hard. The cameraman stared at him. "You're actually going to do it?" Jason nodded, his jaw tight. "I don't have a choice." He opened his streaming app and hit the Go Live button. Within seconds, the views started climbing. Thousands of people tuned in, eager to see what Jason had to say. "Hey everyone," Jason began, his voice shaky. "So, I messed up." He looked into the camera, feeling the weight of his words. "I thought I was being funny. I thought it was just a harmless prank. But I crossed a line, and I disrespected people who didn't deserve it. The Royal Guards stand for tradition and honor, and I made fun of that." He paused, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry. To the guards, to the people who respect them, and to everyone watching, I'm sorry." He ended the stream before the comments could roll in. The cameraman clapped him on the shoulder. "You did the right thing, man." But Jason didn't feel relief. He felt exposed. Vulnerable. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. As he turned to shut his laptop, his phone buzzed one last time. "Well done. But we're not finished." Jason's stomach sank. Jason woke up the next morning feeling hollow. He hadn't slept much. Every sound in the hotel, doors closing, footsteps in the hall, had made him jump. The guards had retreated into silence, and that was worse than the messages and calls. The apology live stream had been humiliating, but Jason had hoped it would end things. Instead, the final text hung over him like a threat. It wasn't a message of closure. It was a warning. He stared at his phone, half expecting another text to appear. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. Jason's cameraman knocked on the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. "You look terrible," the cameraman said. Jason ignored him and grabbed his coat. "Let's just go out and clear our heads." "You sure that's a good idea?" Jason didn't answer. He needed to prove to himself that it was over. He needed to walk outside without seeing guards in every shadow. But the moment they stepped onto the street, Jason knew it wasn't over. A group of tourists spotted him almost immediately. "It's him!" someone shouted. Jason flinched, instinctively pulling his hood up, but the damage was done. People started crowding around him, pulling out phones and recording. "Hey! Do the guard prank again! Make him move! Come on, smile for the camera!" Jason forced a weak grin and tried to push through the crowd, but the phones followed him. He could hear their comments, their laughter, and it felt like knives digging into his skin. He wasn't the one filming anymore. He was the target. The cameraman tried to shield him, but Jason was too exposed. The faces around him blurred, but one stood out, Edward Langley. He was standing by the palace gates, dressed in his full uniform, completely still. Jason's breath hitched. Edward didn't move, didn't react, but his presence felt heavier than any crowd. Jason's legs moved on their own, dragging him toward Edward. He didn't even know why. Maybe he wanted to prove something. Maybe he was desperate for answers. The tourists followed, sensing something was about to happen. Phones were raised, and the crowd grew larger as Jason stopped in front of Edward. The two men stood face to face. One perfectly composed, the other visibly unraveling. Jason's voice cracked as he spoke. "Just stop, okay? You win. I apologized. Isn't that enough?" Edward didn't flinch. Jason's frustration bubbled over. "Say something. Just talk to me." Finally, Edward moved. He took one step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement. The crowd fell silent. Edward's eyes locked onto Jason's. "You wanted my attention," Edward said, his voice firm and clear. "Now you have it." Jason froze. He had spent so much time chasing reactions, but now, with the guard finally speaking, he felt small, like a child being scolded. "You thought this was a joke," Edward continued, his voice steady but sharp. "You mocked our discipline, our purpose. But what have you proven? That you can disrespect people who can't fight back? That's not strength. That's cowardice." Jason's mouth opened, but no words came out. The crowd hung on every word, and Jason could feel their judgment pressing down on him. Edward stepped closer, towering over him. "You don't understand what it means to stand here. To hold this line. To be a symbol for something greater than yourself. You saw the uniform and thought it was armor you could dent. But this isn't armor." Edward tapped his chest lightly. "This is pride. Duty. And you tried to break it for likes and views." Jason's knees felt weak. He wanted to disappear, to vanish into the crowd, but he couldn't move. Edward didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice carried more weight than anything Jason had ever heard. "You wanted to humiliate me, but look at yourself," Edward said. "Look at what you've become." Jason turned and saw his reflection in the glass window of a nearby shop. His face was pale, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes red and tired. He didn't look like the confident prankster his fans admired. He looked scared. Broken. "This ends now," Edward said. "But not because I say so. Because you finally understand what it means to face someone who won't break." Jason felt the last bit of his composure shatter. He dropped to his knees, not because Edward told him to, but because the weight of it all was too much. The crowd gasped, and the cameras kept rolling. "I'm sorry," Jason whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Edward didn't respond. He turned sharply, returning to his position at the gate. Silent once more. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others jeering. Phones recorded every angle of Jason's collapse, capturing his humiliation for the world to see. Jason stayed on his knees, the noise around him fading into a blur. The guards had beaten him, not with fists, but with patience, precision, and unshakable discipline. When Jason finally stood and stumbled away from the palace, he knew his reputation was gone. The prankster who made others the butt of the joke had become the joke himself. But what haunted him most wasn't the cameras or the comments. It was Edward's words, calm, sharp, and unshakable. "You finally understand." Jason didn't sleep that night. He knew the video would go viral. He knew the comments would tear him apart. But as much as he hated what happened, a part of him knew Edward was right. And that truth hurt more than anything else. Jason sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The video of his public humiliation had gone viral, millions of views within hours. Every major platform had picked it up. Headlines labeled him the prankster who got humbled, and the man who lost to a royal guard. The comments were relentless. He deserved it. Finally, someone put him in his place. Respect isn't a game. Maybe now he gets it. Jason closed his laptop and leaned back, rubbing his temples. The world had seen him fall apart. The fear, the desperation, the breakdown, it was all out there for everyone to dissect. But strangely, it wasn't anger he felt anymore. It was exhaustion. He had built his career on tearing others down, all for the sake of laughs and views. But now, he knew what it felt like to be on the other side, to be the target. And it wasn't funny. For days, Jason avoided the internet. He ignored calls, texts, and emails. Even his cameraman gave up after the third voicemail. Jason wasn't ready to face anyone, not yet. But the silence gave him time to think. Edward's words echoed in his mind. "You don't understand what it means to stand here. You tried to break something that doesn't bend." Jason hated how those words made him feel small, guilty, ashamed. But they also made him think. He had spent years looking for easy laughs, never stopping to consider the damage left behind. And now, after facing Edward, he finally understood what it meant to stand for something. He couldn't run from it anymore. Jason reopened his laptop and hit record. The screen lit up, and for the first time in days, Jason looked straight into the camera, not as a performer, but as himself. "Hey everyone," he began softly. "I don't even know where to start." His voice shook, but he pushed through. "I've spent the past few days thinking about everything that's happened, about the prank, the apology, and what came after. And the truth is, I was wrong. I didn't get it before, but I do now." Jason paused, his throat tightening. "When I stood in front of that guard, I saw someone I thought I could break. I thought it would be funny to test him, to make him look weak. But what I saw wasn't weakness. It was strength, real strength. The kind that doesn't need to shout or fight to prove itself." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "Edward Langley, yeah, I know your name now. You showed me what it means to have discipline, honor, and respect for something bigger than yourself. And I took that for granted. I'm sorry, not just for what I did to you, but for what I've done to so many people over the years. I get it now. And I'm done with the pranks." Jason leaned closer to the camera. "This isn't for views. It's not for likes. It's just me saying I'm sorry and promising to do better. I hope that's enough." He ended the video and hit upload before he could talk himself out of it. The response wasn't immediate. Hours passed without much attention. But by the next morning, it had exploded. "This feels real. Maybe there's hope for him after all. Respect earned." And then came the comment Jason never expected. "Apology accepted. Edward Langley." Jason stared at the screen, unable to move. The comment wasn't long, but it carried more weight than any video, headline, or text. For the first time in weeks, Jason smiled, not out of relief, but out of gratitude. Jason stood outside the palace gates again, but this time he wasn't there to mock anyone. He wore a simple suit, no cameras, no crew, just him and a small notebook tucked under his arm. The tourists were there as usual, snapping photos and admiring the guards. Jason spotted Edward immediately, standing tall and unshaken, just like before. He waited until the crowd thinned out before approaching. Edward saw him coming but didn't move. Jason stopped a few feet away, standing just outside the invisible line of respect he hadn't understood before. "Corporal Langley," Jason said. "I didn't think you'd still be here." Edward's eyes shifted ever so slightly, a hint of recognition flashing in them. But he said nothing. "I just wanted to say," Jason cleared his throat, "thank you for teaching me a lesson I didn't even know I needed. I wrote something for you." He held out the notebook, its cover embossed with the words, "Unbroken." Edward didn't take it, but his eyes lingered on it for a moment before he looked back at Jason. No words were exchanged, but Jason understood. Respect didn't always need to be spoken. He nodded and stepped back, blending into the crowd as Edward remained still, his presence as commanding as ever. Jason walked away, feeling lighter. He had made peace with what happened, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And for the first time, Jason Holt wasn't chasing views. He was chasing respect.